After escorting Martin Septim to the Elder Council chambers, your meeting with High Councillor Okato is interrupted by a soldier, announcing the presence of Daedra and Oblivion gates in the city. Emperor Septim decides that it is best to head to the Temple of the One to attempt to relight the dragon fires. So you follow him outside, protecting him from the Daedric attackers. However, once you arrive at the Temple of the One, Martin Septim says to you,
"We're too late. Mehrunes Dagon is here. Lighting the dragon fires will no longer save us. The barriers that protected us from oblivion are gone."
Hello and welcome to Anatomy of Fiction. In today's video, we will be discussing Mehrunes Dagon. More specifically, why would anyone choose to worship Mehrunes Dagon? To do this, we will have to go over several things, starting with who is Mehrunes Dagon. So, what is he known as and what is he associated with? After this, we will move on to discussing the history of Mehrunes Dagon. So, the historical events he has been involved in, his legacy, the various things he is known for. Then we will move on to who worships Mehrunes Dagon, including his various cults, how he is worshipped, and any mythology surrounding him. And finally, we will move on to discuss the various creations of Mehrunes Dagon, like his realm in Oblivion, his servants, and the various artifacts associated with him. So let us begin with who is Mehrunes Dagon. So Mehrunes Dagon is one of the Daedric Princes. To the Dunmer, he is considered to be one of the four corners of the House of Troubles, so one of the bad Daedra. Now Mehrunes Dagon is a Daedric Prince of many names, including having his own proteonymic and neonymic, these being an entity's incantatory name or true name, as these nymics define an entity. Now these nymics are important as they are unable to be changed or abandoned by the Daedra. Mehrunes Dagon's proteonymic is Lekeloga, which is shown on the screen, and his neonymic is Die Koleo Debe Fe Zepe, which is again on the screen. Now, Mehrunes Dagon is also known by other names, including a formal title, supposedly used by the Dremora. To the Dremora, Mehrunes Dagon is known as the Exalted and Most Puissant Lord, Garant of Dagon Mehrunes. The Dremora would also refer to him as the Great Daedra Lord. Outside of the circles of the Dremora and in the circles of mortals, he is known by other names, like the Lord of Fire and Flood, the Prince of Disaster and Destruction, these names coming from the link between Mehrunes Dagon and natural disasters, as supposedly communing with Mehrunes Dagon can bring these on, along with his own penchant for destruction and disasters. This is why many of his other names go along with this theme, like the Sovereign of Destruction, the Flame Tyrant, and even the Father of Cataclysm. So based on who Mehrunes Dagon is, why would anyone choose to worship him? Well, with Mehrunes Dagon being so heavily linked with destruction and change in general, it does give us a hint to the sorts of people who would be interested in joining a cult that was focused on him. So firstly, those who enjoy destruction, like for example, arsonists. So if we consider the warning that the Fighters Guild General, Flaminus Octor, provides about Mehrunes Dagon cultists, is that they exhibit a sick fascination with setting buildings, animals, and people ablaze, very much hinting at their own destructive nature. We also see General Flaminus warning that Dagon cultists do prey on very specific types of people when recruiting for their cults. These groups being outcasts, criminals, and unruly teenagers. This is likely due to them being vulnerable groups that are easier to manipulate than other members of the community. So those who are likely to worship Mehrunes Dagon are likely to be some form of social outcast due to their disconnection from their own society, as they are easier to isolate and convince. Some would also desire revenge for what they believe unfair treatment, like criminals. They may believe their own prosecution and persecution was unfair. So seeking out a god who may be able to help them with this is likely to motivate many to begin worshipping Mehrunes Dagon. However, this is only one piece of the puzzle, not the whole picture. To learn more, we should discuss the history of Mehrunes Dagon. The history of Mehrunes Dagon begins in the early First Era, this being with the construction of the Nefari Vigum. So this foul construct of Mehrunes Dagon was said to test pilgrims who sought out Mehrunes' razor. So a pilgrim was supposed to seek this construct out, and an unknown trial would occur to test their worth. Now the Aelids, being the Aelids, sought out the construct. They believed themselves capable of stopping anyone else who would seek out Mehrunes' razor through the construct. So what did they do? They built Vasa Balim, this being a great ringed labyrinthian city during the height of their rule. This worked wonders to deter and stop pilgrims who came after the Nefari Vigam, this being until a vampire would slip into the city unnoticed. The vampire would create chaos as the elves in the city would become infected with vampirism. The city would descend into madness and ruin, and then Vasa Balim would just disappear. What would cause the disappearance of the city is debated, with some suggesting that it was a final safety mechanism. Others would suggest it was a natural cataclysm, and some would even suggest that it was the divines themselves that would cause it. However, there is one thing everyone agrees on. Whatever the cause, they would all result in the same thing. The mountains of the eastern Niben would swallow Vasa Balim and the Nefari Vigam along with it. But anyway, moving on. Also in the early First Era and over to Morrowind. Now this is where we first begin to see his destructive nature. In Morrowind, there was a settlement known as Ald Sotha, this being the seat of the minor Khyma house Sotha. Mehrunes Dagon and his army would destroy Ald Sotha and all of its inhabitants. Well, all but one. The lone survivor of the destruction being Sotha Sil, who would be rescued by Vivek, this being before they both had achieved godhood. Now if we jump forward to the year 2920 in the First Era, we would see Mehrunes Dagon being summoned to Cold Harbor by Sotha Sil, as Sotha Sil was now a living god. Mehrunes Dagon, along with 7 other Daedric princes, would meet Sotha Sil in Cold Harbor, this being due to the actions of Molag Bal, who would destroy Gilvardel. Here in Cold Harbor, Sotha Sil would strike up a deal between him and the 8 Daedric princes to prevent them from directly meddling in the affairs of mortals, this becoming known as the Cold Harbor Compact. Even though Mehrunes Dagon was part of the Cold Harbor Compact, his initial attitude towards it was really just indifference. He still viewed Sotha Sil as a mere mortal that he could crush just as easily as he had Sotha Sil's childhood home. He would see this attitude appear only a few months later when Mehrunes Dagon would be summoned by a woman known as Turala. Now the story of Turala is a rather interesting one. So Turala was a Dunmeri woman that was part of House Redoran, who also happened to be the Duke of Mournhold's mistress. Turala in the year 2920 would end up pregnant with the Duke's child. Turala would tell the Duke and would be kicked out of the Duke's castle, and of course the city of Mournhold. So she would return to her homelands. Here she would speak to her father, telling him that she was pregnant, and that the father was the Duke of Mournhold, a member of House Indoril. Turala's father, being a proud member of House Redoran, would banish her from Morrowind for her actions. This would lead to Turala wandering through the wilderness, making her way to Cyrodiil. She would find herself in the dense forest of Cyrodiil, where she would begin to feel strange. As this was occurring, she would notice a strange bird perched in the tree. She would then go into labor, and it would turn out that this strange bird was no bird at all, but an Ayleid. She would faint. When she would awaken, she would find the baby crying by her side. It had been cleaned and the Ayleid was nowhere to be seen. Turala would then pick up the child and continue walking through the forest. Eventually, during her time in Cyrodiil, she would encounter a Breton by the name of Cassia Whiteley. He would approach her and ask if she and her baby Bosriel would like to accompany him on his journey. Cassia would take Turala and Bosriel along with him, eventually bringing them to High Rock. Here he would introduce Turala and baby Bosriel to the Skeffington Coven. Cassia would leave them with the Coven, believing that they would be safe. So Turala would stay with the Coven. She would begin to learn magic here, becoming incredibly skilled. Here, she would accidentally summon a Daedroth after only being there for a month and a day. The leader of the Coven, Ministera, would compliment her talent, then request she run an errand. She would send Turala and 2 other members of the Coven to Wayrest for this errand. Turala would leave her child with the Coven, believing that she was in good hands. They would head out for Wayrest on their horses to collect the items needed for their Coven. Then, 19 days later, they were about to arrive home. This is when they would encounter someone one Turala recognized, Cassia. Cassia would tell Turala that he needed the Skeffington Coven, so Turala would tell Cassia to ride with them. The group of 4 would chat as they rode onto the home of the Skeffington Coven. However, as they arrived, they did not find the other members. Instead, they were greeted by the ashes, skeletons, and broken weapons that remained of their home. Turala cried for her baby Bosriel. However, there was no sign of her infant, just ashes and carnage. Cassia would take advantage of the situation and answer Turala's cries for her baby, lying to her about who committed such a violent act. Cassia would claim that the Duke had sent assassins after her. He knew she still held resentment towards the Duke for his actions, and this would allow for Cassia to take his revenge on the Duke through Turala. 14 days later, on the 12th of Sun's Dusk, 2920, Mehrunes Dagon would be summoned in Mournhold. All that would remain of Castle Mournhold was an ever-erupting flame blasting up towards the sky. There would be a thick, tarry smoke that would roll through the city streets. This would ignite everything made of wood or paper. Bat-like creatures would torment citizens, driving them from their hiding places into the open, where they would be met by Mehrunes Dagon's army. Mehrunes Dagon would smile as he surveyed his destruction. He would then spot Sothasil and Almalexia in the distance. He would tell them that if they were looking for the Duke, they would not find him. However, they might find pieces of him the next time it rains. Almalexia would tell Mehrunes Dagon they could not kill him, but that would be something he would regret. The 2 living gods and Mehrunes Dagon would fight on the ruins of Mournhold. During this fight, Almalexia would plunge her sword, Hope's Fire, into Mehrunes Dagon. Scorching blood would run out of these wounds onto Almalexia's hands and face. She would fall, but would be caught by veins of metallic ores that would erupt from the depths to catch her. Sothasil would turn these veins of ore into god bronze whips and lash Mehrunes Dagon with them. Sothasil would use Mehrunes Dagon's mimic against him. He would banish Mehrunes Dagon back to the Deadlands. Whilst this was occurring, Mehrunes Dagon would steal part of Mournhold that was still occupied by the living and bring it with him. As punishment for breaking the Cold Harbour Compact, Sothasil would seal the planar doors between Nian and the Deadlands. Moving on to the Second Era. This is when we would begin to see cults of Mehrunes Dagon followers emerging. The first of these would begin in the year 115. This cult was known as the Brotherhood of Destruction. They were located in Imperial City, made up of the destitute who inhabited the city. Now, for the first 5 years, the Brotherhood of Destruction would operate quietly. They would silently gather members until the year 120, as this is when they would begin their strike against middle-class merchants of the city. The cult would kidnap key members and torture them to death. This would cripple many trade routes. This cult would disappear in the year 140 in the Second Era. If we move on to the year 243, we would see another short-lived cult of Mehrunes Dagon, this being the Bloodfire cult. Now, the Bloodfire cult was not one for subtlety. This group, unlike the Brotherhood of Destruction, was actually made up of almost entirely members of the nobility. The cult attempted to crush the heart of Ravenwatch. So with the help of their foot servants, the cultists would go around locking the doors to each of the great houses in the city, then would set them on fire. Thankfully for the members of the great houses who were not part of the cult, they were actually warned by a handful of servants, this sparing them from a rather gruesome death. The Bloodfire cult would only last a year, as every member of the cult would be captured and then sentenced to death for their actions. But anyway, moving on to some point in the Second Era. This supposedly happened in East March over in Skyrim. So, supposedly there was a witch known as Hranvard Frostfinger. Now, Hranvard was no nice witch. No, she was said to have sacrificed 13 innocent lives to Mehrunes Dagon in one night. This was said to have briefly opened a portal between Skyrim and Oblivion. The only witnesses to this was said to be Dire Frost family, who happened to be a clan of witch hunters. We followed the stench of burning flesh for a half mile, and we caught up to Hranvard at night by the Sea of Ghosts. She lay there cackling among her 13 victims, whose bodies had been stacked in a mass grave, encircled in spidery writing. Slaying her was an easy task. All it took was one silver vault. But when the deed was done, the air suddenly began to boil and crack. Fearing some residual spell, I had my men retreat up to the nearest pass. When we watched the snow below catch fire and the sky split apart with flame, we turned to flee, but it was too late. Fire poured from the wound in the air and engulfed my 30 men. I tried to help them, but the flames wouldn't die and wouldn't burn my flesh. A voice bellowed from the burning moor above, "You will suffer better among the living." This is the account of the last surviving member of the Dire Frost family, Yolothon, who was a well-respected member of the Dire Frost family. However, many are skeptical of his account. But anyway, moving on. This being over to the Reach in the year 527 in the Second Era, with Reachman Chieftain Duakurak. He was building a following over in the Reach and would end up forming an alliance with the Tag Joylock Coven. With the assistance of this coven, Duakurak would subdue all rival clans, this of course being through the use of Daedric deals. With this, we would see one of these deals occurring with Mehrunes Dagon. This deal would promise that Duakurak would be crowned Emperor of Cyrodiil, this being in return for the rituals that would be performed. Part of this being preparations for the ritual to create the 4 ambitions. Now, moving on to the year 533, as this is when Duakurak would gather a massive army of Reach warriors to attack and seize the Ruby Throne, crowning Duakurak as the Emperor of Cyrodiil, thus beginning the Reachman dynasty known as the Longhouse Emperors. Now, this would start the work behind the creation of the 4 ambitions. The son of Duakurak, Morikar, would work on forging the ambitions once he became emperor. To do this, he would have an annex built underneath the imperial city. So work would continue on the 4 ambitions, and eventually the throne would pass on to Morikar's son, Leovic, to continue ruling the empire and to continue working on the 4 ambitions. During his time on the throne, Leovic would decide to legalize Daedra worship, which did not go down all too well with the Colovians in Cyrodiil. Instead, it would lead to a rebellion led by Duke Varin Aquilarios. This would be the Colovian Revolt. Varin would have an army fight behind him, attempting to remove Leovic from the throne. And in the year 577, they would be at the gates of the imperial city. This would lead to Leovic gathering those who knew about part of his plan to the annex, including his steward Farul Lupus and the leader of the Order of the Waking Flame. Here, they would appeal to Mehrunes Dagon again, hoping that he would save them. If this would fail, Leovic would place the responsibility for finishing the 4 ambitions onto the High Priest of the Order of the Waking Flame. This, however, would not save Leovic, as Varin and his army would breach the gates of the imperial city, and Varin would slay Leovic in his own throne room, thus ending the Longhouse dynasty. Now moving forward to the year 582. This is when Farul Lupus would hire Iveli Sharp Arrow to find a book, but this would lead to Farul getting assassinated, supposedly by the Dark Brotherhood. However, things seemed a little fishy. Now, with not everything as it seemed, it would prompt Iveli and the Vestige to investigate the imperial sewers. Here, they would find a ritual that indicated that the cult were trying to find the locations of the 4 ambitions. The Vestige and Iveli would follow Doombringer Ashil through the portal to the Deadlands. They would follow at a distance, listening to the conversation. This being until Mehrunes Dagon would tell Ashil to kill them, as they were intruders in the Deadlands. So the Vestige and Iveli would fight Ashil, and the Daedra he sent after them. Once they defeated Ashil, they would be sent out of the Deadlands without a word from Dagon. So Iveli and the Vestige decided to go through the journal of Emperor Leovic and visit those mentioned in his list, hoping to warn them about the supposed Dark Brotherhood assassins that were targeting them, along with questioning them about their knowledge of the ambitions. This would lead the duo to Blackwood, as this is where several of those who were mentioned in the journal were. They had managed to find important positions outside of the Longhouse dynasty. However, Iveli and the Vestige would not manage to meet up with several of the councillors. Why would this be? Well, they were murdered. These murders allegedly being done by the Dark Brotherhood. This would lead to the Vestige and Iveli being sent to investigate the Dark Brotherhood to find out why they had supposedly been assassinating the council members. Who could have given them this contract? This investigation would be no easy task, as with the Vestige and Iveli searching the Bloodrun Cave to find the Dark Brotherhood, they would be ambushed by the Waking Flame cultists. These cultists had set out to kill the Dark Brotherhood members along with the Vestige and Iveli. This would lead to the Vestige and Elam Drals following some of the retreating cultists back to their base, which is where they would find out that their leader was actually one of the counselors, this being Counselor Vendacia, and that they were planning to attack the castle where the other counselors were being held. The Vestige would hurry back to Leowin Castle, where they would find the Waking Flame cultists barricaded inside the castle with the counselors. This is where the Vestige would rejoin Iveli and reveal to her that it was actually Counselor Vendacia who was behind everything. Vendacia was the one ordering around the Waking Flame cultists and having them impersonate the Dark Brotherhood, killing off some of the other counselors. Anyway, Iveli and the Vestige would manage to breach the barracks and enter the castle. Here they would fight their way through cultists and eventually find Counselor Vendacia, but they would be unable to stop him from murdering Counselor Valeria, seeing her get blasted over the railing and falling to her death. The Vestige and Iveli would not be able to catch Vendacia as he would teleport away, so they would continue their search through the castle in an attempt to stop him from harming anyone else. They would eventually find Vendacia levitating Counselor Leviticus over the ledge. Vendacia would let Leviticus go. The Vestige, Iveli, and her brother Baragon would manage to save Leviticus, whilst managing to fight off the Daedra Vendacia had summoned. Vendacia would manage to escape yet again. Once the threat of the Waking Flame was over at the castle, the Vestige would be sent to speak to Governor Keshu. Keshu would send the Vestige and Iveli to a place known as Ogel Bak, which happened to be in the Sul Zan territory, which happens to be very dangerous due to the Argonians who live there. So the Vestige and Iveli would meet up at Ogel Bak. Here they would find a strange Daedric structure along with a Dremora known as Lyranth. Lyranth would tell the Vestige and Iveli that she had followed the Waking Flame cultists to the vault. However, due to the wards, she could not follow them inside. Lyranth, in her conversation with the Vestige and Iveli, would observe that Iveli was holding a book, which she believed that she recognized. Lyranth believed that the book was actually the Mysterium Zarsus, which she would advise Iveli to place on the pedestal to help with dispelling the wards. The Vestige would manage to break the wards, which would lead to Lyranth teleporting away into the vault. Iveli and the Vestige would head into the vault, eventually meeting up with Lyranth again, who tells them that Mehrunes Dagon seeks to merge Nian with the Deadlands, and that she believes the ambitions are part of his plan to do so. In the group's exploration of the vault, they encounter twins, Kalia and Destron. The twins would not know anything about the four ambitions. However, there would be signs of Mehrunes Dagon worship in the vault they were kept in. The Waking Flame would then arrive. The Vestige would help the twins escape. These twins would get cornered by Waking Flame cultists, this leading to one of the twins, Destron, using his power to free them, as he was concerned that the cultists were going to harm them. Once the cultists were all dealt with, it was obvious to the Vestige and Iveli that the twins were actually two of the four ambitions, and this would lead to them convincing the twins to come with them. The Vestige and Iveli would return to Gideon with the twins to discuss with Keshu their findings. Eventually, the Vestige and Iveli would receive an unsigned letter requesting that they meet with the author. So Iveli and the Vestige would enter Amnis Manor, as the note instructed. As it would turn out, they were meeting with Elam Drals, Elam being the Dark Brotherhood member who the Vestige had met with previously, when the Dark Brotherhood were accused of assassinating the counselors. Now, Elam would tell the Vestige and Iveli that he believed there was actually someone who worshipped Mehrunes Dagon in secret in Gideon, and that they were likely funding much of the Waking Flame's activities. This someone being Mattus Amnis, the owner of the manor that they were meeting in. Now, Mattus was not present at the manor. However, there was evidence as to where he had gone, this being through a letter asking if Mattus had received the invitation to Vendacia's latest party. Along with this letter, there was also a cover letter for the invitation present in the Amnis Manor. This cover letter indicated that the special event required special attire and a special coin to attend. The regular letter mentioned Salvito Estate, suggesting that Vendacia took refuge there after the earlier events. So the Vestige and Iveli would head to Salvito Estate near Blackwood Lake to look for a way into the special event. They would find the estate crawling with cultists. Making their way upstairs in the estate, they would find Gracian Salvito, who would attempt to escape a pleasant conversation, this being through the second story window. However, the Vestige would manage to catch up with the skedaddling noble. and would ask him a few questions. The vestige would find out that Vandacia had been at Salvito Estate with someone who he had taken prisoner. However, Vandacia had left with his prisoner. The vestige would then take Salvito's invitation to the event and his coin, which would allow them entry. The vestige would show this to Aveli, who would recognize the symbol as being similar to that on the book she was carrying, this being the Mysterium Zarsis. The vestige and Aveli would end up meeting in Leowin and eventually boarding the boat known as the Calamity. The ship would take them to where Vandacia was hosting the party, which actually happened to be in the Deadlands, Mehrunes Dagon's plane in Oblivion. Talk about a fun party. As Vandacia happened to have a keep in the Deadlands. The vestige would search the keep for the third ambition. Deep within the keep, the vestige would find a Nord known as Sombren, who was chained up. The vestige would search for a key to free Sombren in hopes of taking the ambition away from Vandacia. However, this would not be so easily achieved, as once the vestige would find the key, the party had already started, making freeing the prisoner a little more difficult than sneaking them out the back door. So the vestige and Aveli would need a distraction. This would lead to the vestige placing a sort of smoke bomb to create a cloud of noxious fumes to fill the room, and Aveli firing off some arrows, which would send the cultists panicking. The vestige would then sneak off and rescue Sombren. The vestige and Aveli would manage to rescue Sombren, and the trio would head back to the entry hall to meet up with Lyranth, so that Lyranth could open a portal back to Neon for them. The trio, however, would be halted in their pursuit of freedom, as Vandacia would send a Dremora after them by the name of Falconaz Oran. So they would have to fight the Dremora off whilst Lyranth opened a portal for them. After defeating the Dremora, they would enter the portal, leaving the Deadlands and ending up just outside of Gideon, making their way to the Temple of Dibella, where the other two rescued ambitions were being kept. However, Keshu did not believe that the ambitions would be safe in the temple, which is what Keshu would tell the vestige. The vestige would find this out for themselves, as they would walk into the temple to observe one of the twins, Kalia, her powers being out of control. Thankfully for the twins and the temple, Sombren would manage to calm Kalia down and control her powers before she had caused too much damage. Sombren would advise the vestige that his old mentor, a Dremora by the name of Xena, may be able to help with the twins' out of control powers, as she was able to help him learn to control his powers. The vestige would communicate with Xena to see if she could help, which in their discussion she claimed they could. But the twins would need to be brought to Xena's sanctuary, which happened to be in the Deadlands. The vestige would prepare the twins for the Deadlands, eventually taking them to Xena's sanctuary. As the vestige handed the twins over, they would be betrayed, the vestige being teleported into a dungeon where Sombren had been teleported into as well, after his powers had been drained. The vestige would work on getting them out. The vestige would manage to recharge the powers of Sombren. In their search for the twins, they would find Xena attempting to sacrifice them. However, the vestige would manage to rescue the twins, which would allow the vestige to discover the real purpose of the four ambitions. The vestige would inform Governor Keshu, who would tell them that they needed to head over to Fort Redmane and prepare to defend it. The vestige would gather allies from the surrounding areas in Blackwood, then head over to Fort Redmane. The cultists would attack the fort through portals into the courtyard. The vestige would help to fight off the attackers in the courtyard. The vestige would then head into the guardhouse where the ambitions were being kept. However, the guardhouse was not as safe as it seemed, as the Waking Flame cultists had managed to infiltrate the guardhouse. Aveli and the vestige would fight off the cultists, and would look for the ambitions deeper into the guardhouse. The vestige would attempt to defend the ambitions from further attacks. However, the worst would happen. Vandacia would kill one of the twins, Destron. He would use the power released by Destron's death to begin merging Fort Redmane with the Deadlands. The other two ambitions would flee into the keep to protect themselves. However, the keep would be filled with cultists, making it no safer. Kalia, enraged by her brother's death, would manage to wipe out all of the cultists with her powers, and Sombren would attempt to calm her down as they were concerned that she would lose control. They would find Vandacia and Mehrunes Dagon in the courtyard. The vestige would kill Vandacia and send Mehrunes Dagon back to the Deadlands. This would seemingly be the last of the ambitions. However, there was still a fourth ambition that was yet to be found. We see this issue pick up again with the vestige being summoned to the city of Fargrave in Oblivion by Lyranth. As it would turn out, Neon was not the only place in danger, as the Waking Flame cultists also had plans for the demiplane of Fargrave. Loranth would inform the Vestige and the Anchorite that one of the members of the Waking Flame, this being Sister Seldina, planned to seize control of Fargrave to use it and its many portals as a gateway into Nian, doing this to get around the sealed doors between the Deadlands and Nian from the last time Mehrunes Dagon broke the Cold Harbor Compact. As it would turn out, Seldina had placed runes that, if successful, would destroy all of the Daedra in Fargrave, leaving it defenseless, which would have left it ripe for the taking. The Vestige would destroy the runes and Seldina would teleport away. The group would search the abandoned bathhouse they had found Seldina in hopes they could find a clue to point them in the direction of the Waking Flame cultists' next moves, which they would find. This would be in the form of a coded letter. This would lead the Vestige on a new quest, looking for someone or something that could decode the letter. The Vestige would first head to Madame Wim to see if she could point them in the right direction. Madame Wim would point them in the direction of a watcher known as the Collector. The Collector would claim they had something within their collection known as the Aurochs that could potentially decode the note. The Vestige would find the Aurochs, however, the Aurochs was not an artifact. Instead, it was a Daedrat that could talk. The Vestige would free Aurochs and he would decode the note. The note would claim that the Waking Flame Daedric allies were gathering troops at the burning Gaia Keep, a fortress over in the Deadlands in preparation to invade Fargrave. The Vestige would head to the burning Gaia Keep and meet the Anchorite and Loranth just outside of the keep. As they arrive, an explosion would occur within the area. They would head inside the keep to investigate. Inside, the group would find a broken sword of the Blade Bearers clan, this being a Dremora clan that is not associated with Mehrunes Dagon. The trio would continue searching the keep and would encounter Seldina, the Cyclone Incarnate, and Valkanaz Nokfroz. Seldina would order the Incarnate to attack the Vestige and their group in an attempt to get rid of them. However, they would manage to defeat the Incarnate. Nokfroz and Seldina would actually manage to escape though. The Vestige and their companions would head back to Fargrave to Madame Wim's to discuss their findings, and meet up with their strange companion Aurochs in hopes that he would be able to help them find the Bladebearers clan. The group would then head out to the Wretched Spire to talk to Rinkius to see if he had any clues about where the Bladebearer's sword may have come from. As it would turn out, there were several members of the Bladebearers clan who had gone missing, and members of this clan would never willingly be found in a fortress of those loyal to Mehrunes Dagon. Rinkius had sent out scouts to attempt to find these missing members. However, these scouts also disappeared. The Vestige and Rinkius would discuss the device creating the Incarnates that the Waking Flame cultists had made, and Rinkius would request the Vestige accompany him in the search for his missing kin. They would search Jin's foundry and Sayanoa's jail. After the searching of these locations, Rinkius and the Vestige would meet up with Loranth, the Anchorite, and Aurochs. In this conversation, they would discuss who the inventor of the catalyst, this being the machine transforming the Daedra, was. The inventor was an Imperial known as Elegian. Aurochs would inform the group that he knew where to find Elegian. However, not all members would be able to come with, as Loranth and Rinkius, being Daedra, would raise alarm bells as they were not aligned with Mehrunes Dagon. So Aurochs would take the Anchorite and the Vestige to the Blood Pit. The Vestige and the Anchorite would have to unlock Elegian's cell. They would talk to Elegian, who would claim that he regretted his invention and he wished that the Vestige would destroy it. He would tell the Vestige and the Anchorite where to find the Riven Catalyst. Elegian would then give the Anchorite a necklace. The Vestige, Aurochs, and the Anchorite would then sneak out of the prison cell, heading back to the Wretched Spire. After discussing their findings with Loranth, Aurochs, and the Vestige would begin to climb Anilark's summit. During the climb, Aurochs would jump out of the Vestige's bag and indicate a cave they had found, suggesting that this cave may be a shortcut as it had the scent of Nokfroz. The Vestige would follow Aurochs through the cave. However, nearing the end, Aurochs would lose the scent, instead picking up the smell of mortal blood. This would lead to the group investigating the cave, finding a dead cultist with a strange twisted rod. The group would continue on and find a portal to Fort Grief, an abandoned fort in Cyrodiil. Through exploring the old fort, they would find members of the Bladebearers clan and would release them. Here, the vestige would find out that the Riven Catalyst, the machine transforming the Daedra into incarnates, was located beneath Fort Grief Citadel. The group would continue on deeper into the fort, searching for the Riven Catalyst. There, they would be attacked by an incarnate sent by Sister Saldina. With the destruction of the incarnate, there would be damage to the Fort Grief Citadel. This would lead to the building beginning to fall around them. The group would use a portal to escape Fort Grief, landing back at the wretched spire in Fargrave. The vestige and Aurochs would then be sent to check out 3 sites that the scouts of the Bladebearers clan indicated as having cultist activity. They would investigate these sites, finding clues they would need, learning the location of the portal to Deadlight. The vestige would head to the portal, meeting the rest of their group there. The vestige would talk to the anchorite, learning that the anchorite was beginning to recover her memories of her past. Now, the anchorite had previously appeared in Fargrave with no memories of who she was or her past. This being due to the strange mask she wears. The enchantment on the mask was losing its grip on the anchorite. The group would go through the portal and infiltrate the Deadlight Citadel. In their search of the Citadel, they would find the Deadlight Archives. These archives held information about the history of the Waking Flame cult, along with the creation of the catalysts. As it would turn out, Sister Saldina intends to help Mehrunes Dagon destroy the mortal world. The group would continue on in their search for Sister Saldina, eventually stumbling upon a shrine in the Deadlight Citadel. The anchorite would recognize the shrine, feeling a connection to the altar there and her amulet. As it would turn out, the amulet would reveal the anchorite's memories linked to Deadlight when she used it. It would also reveal that the anchorite was actually the daughter of Sister Saldina and Emperor Morikar. The anchorite was actually created to help Mehrunes Dagon destroy the world. However, Elegant would help her to escape and would cause her memories to disappear. This would lead to the anchorite running off to confront Saldina. The vestige would end up catching up and fighting Sister Saldina, defeating her. However, the anchorite would end up being captured by Valkinaz Nokvroz. The vestige and the rest of the group would have to escape Deadlight Citadel through a portal and regroup at the House of Whims in Fargrave, knowing the new information they learnt in the Citadel, coming up with a new plan on how to save the anchorite and stop the Waking Flame cultists from destroying the world. At the House of Whims, the vestige would convince Madame Whim to tune the portal to Ardent Hope. Part of the group would teleport inside of Ardent Hope, this being Valkinaz Nokvroz's fortress, whilst Rinconus would lead the Bladebearers clan in a frontal assault of the fortress as a distraction. The vestige and their group would begin looking for a way deeper into the keep, searching for the anchorite as she was being held there as a prisoner. The vestige and their group would find the anchorite being taken by blood adepts to the volcano to meet with Nokvroz. However, at this time, the Bladebearers clan were in trouble. The clan were surrounded by enemy Dremora. This would lead to the vestige, Lyranth, and Aurochs deciding to break the twisted rod. This would reveal Aurochs' true form, however, would leave him at risk of being permanently cursed. The vestige would attempt to head up the path of cinders to reach the top of the volcano to save the anchorite. However, they would face issues, this being in the form of Nokvroz's mages who would defend the gates on the path. The vestige would summon Aurochs in his true form for assistance with the Dremora mages and the 3 gates. The vestige would then head to the heart of the volcano to save the anchorite. Here the vestige would find Nokvroz and the anchorite along with the perfected catalyst. Nokvroz would use the perfected catalyst on himself and transform himself into a new kind of incarnate. The vestige and the anchorite would manage to defeat the incarnate. As they would destroy the catalyst to prevent any other incarnates from being made, Mehrunes Dagon would appear. The vestige would manage to escape through a portal that Lyranth had created, this ending the Waking Flame's attempt to destroy Neon. But anyway, moving on. This also being around the year 582 in the Second Era, over on the Somerset Isles. So some members of the Altmer would be displeased with the rise of Queen Aeren and her rather tolerant policies when it came to other races. So around the year 582, Altmer separatists would have High Kin Lady Estra become the leader of their group known as the Veiled Heritants. Now where Mehrunes Dagon would be relevant in their hatred of the Queen would be after a failed assassination attempt. The Veiled Heritants had many of their numbers tracked down and killed for their actions, which would lead to Estra travelling to a holy site of the 8 divines, this being Torinan. Here she would make a deal with Mehrunes Dagon, her soul in return for the backing of Daedra to replace her dwindling group. Estra would use these Daedra to attack Dawnbreak, then Firsthold, as she would open Oblivion gates across the city in an attempt to seize control. However, she would ultimately be unsuccessful as Queen Aerian's forces would eventually kill Estra in the refuge of Dread in the Deadlands. The Oblivion Gates would be closed, however the damage was still done and much of Firsthold was destroyed. Anyway, moving on to the Third Era. This being at some point before the year 172, as this is when a longtime servant of House Dirani and a known Daedra summoner by the name of Chimera Gragan would make a pact with Mehrunes Dagon. However, Gragan never intended to keep this oath, deceiving the Daedric Prince. This would lead to Mehrunes Dagon being cast into oblivion and realizing that he was fooled. Dagon did not appreciate this, so he would strike out against Gragan, this being through Gragan's pact. Gragan's pact with Dagon said that Gragan would live forever in his hometown, amongst the happy voices of his friends. Now, Dagon would not go against this pact. Instead, he would scoop up the tiny island of Sicily and hurl it into the void. This would lead to all of Gragan's friends and the other occupants on the island being killed. However, the sounds of their voices would remain. These voices would torment Gragan, who of course would survive, growing older and older as he was destined to live forever, contemplating his actions. As time went on, the plane that Gragan and his island ended up in would become known as the Chimera of Desolation. But anyway, moving on to the year 389 in the Third Era. This being where Jagathan had just taken over the Imperial throne. Jagathan was an Imperial battle mage who betrayed Emperor Uriel Septim VII, with the help of Mehrunes Dagon, being transported to a realm of Jagathan's choosing. This leading to Uriel Septim VII being imprisoned in one of Mehrunes Dagon's dark prisons within the void. This would allow for Jagathan to take over ruling Tamriel through impersonating Uriel Septim VII for an entire decade. This would lead to imperial authority declining in Tamriel and several provincial wars occurring. This time period was known as the Imperial Simulacrum. Now, at the very end of this decade, in the year 398 in the Third Era, we would see Mehrunes Dagon finally manage to invade the Battle Spire after many failed attempts. This being through Zivali Moath making a deal with Jagathan. Now, with this bargain in place, the Battle Spire would be swarming with Daedra. Along with this, the 5 Battle Mage administrators that governed the Battle Spire were killed by Dagon and his Daedra to eliminate all competition for the position of Imperial Battle Mage of Tamriel. Now, prior to Mehrunes Dagon and his forces taking over the Battle Spire, they would gather in Havoc Wellhead. Then they would go on to invade 2 other planes of Oblivion, these being the realm of Nocturnal, which is Shade Perilous, along with the Soul Khan, the realm of the ideal master's creation. Inside of Shade Perilous, there were 2 Dremora clans, the first of these being the Nocturnal, who were imprisoned by Mehrunes Dagon's Daedra, the second of these being the Seducers. Now, some of these Seducers had their will bent, whilst others would willingly join the forces of Dagon. These who converted were remade, they became more powerful and were given wings. They would go on to join the invasion of the Battle Spire. One of these dark Seducers, known as CS, would become close to Mehrunes Dagon, becoming a lover and also his bodyguard. She would be trusted with an artifact of his, known as the Sword of the Moon Reaver. Now, with the Daedric invasion of Battle Spire, they would seal the Weir Gate, this being the portal between Battle Spire and Tamriel, through the use of Dagon's own personal warding seal. However, the occupation of Battle Spire by Mehrunes Dagon's forces would not last forever, this being due to 2 apprentice battle mages who had entered it after it had fallen. One of these apprentices would go ahead first. This apprentice would leave behind notes and helpful items for the second, this being until the first was captured by Dagon's forces and taken to Dagon's hunting lodge. The second apprentice battle mage would continue on through the Battle Spire in search of the first, along with a way back to Tamriel. The second apprentice would follow the trail of Daedric destruction, fighting, bluffing, and making deals to get through the carnage. By following this trail, they would find Nocturnal's realm, Shade Perilous. Here, the apprentice would find the captured Nocturnals and would free their leader, Jaciel Morgan, leading to this group of Dremora offering their help with confronting Mehrunes Dagon's children. This being due to Dagon's children taking over Shade Perilous during their invasion of Battle Spire. The apprentice would continue on their way, eventually making their way over to the Chimera of Desolation. However, this would create new issues, this being the apprentice becoming the hare in the Great Hunt. Luckily, the apprentice would survive and would manage to locate the now very old chimera Gragon. Gragon would offer much help to the apprentice, providing them with the Saviour's Hide and Mehrunes Dagon's proteonymic. The apprentice would then travel to Havoc Wellhead. This is where they would encounter Dagon's Grand Visor, Imago Storm. Now, Storm believed that the conquest of Shade Perilous combined with the invasion of the Battlespire was overreaching in both resources and judgment. In Storm's opinion, Dagon's adoptive children, Phaedra and Zivalai, along with Mehrunes Dagon himself, needed to be temporarily removed from the picture so that Storm could restore order to the Dagon clan. This would lead to Storm giving the apprentice the neonymics of Phaedra, Zivalai, and Mehrunes Dagon. The apprentice, after fighting through Lesser Daedra, would use a portal to the Deadlands to make their way to Dagon's hunting lodge. Here in the hunting lodge, they would find the first apprentice in the inner sanctum chained to the ceiling and paralyzed. The second apprentice, however, would not be affected by the paralysis spell on entry to the inner sanctum, this being due to Chimera Gragon's giving them the Saviour's Hide earlier. This would irritate Mehrunes Dagon, as the apprentice would present more of a challenge. However, this did not stop Dagon from smugly thanking the apprentice for bringing him such powerful items. Dagon would become perturbed when the apprentice would reveal that they knew Dagon's mimics. However, this would not cause Dagon to react. No, Dagon would attack once the apprentice revealed that they had the Sword of the Moon Reaver. This is when the apprentice would summon JCL Morgan, which would distract Mehrunes Dagon, providing the apprentice with time to strike. This would lead to Mehrunes Dagon being sent into the void. With the force unleashed by this, it would partially destroy the Battlespire. Moving on to the next year. So in the year 399 in the Third Era, with Mehrunes Dagon gone, Jagathan had lost his Daedric backing. And with the work of the Eternal Champion, he would not be on the throne much longer, as the Eternal Champion had managed to gather all 8 pieces of the Staff of Chaos, and would link these to the Jewel of Fire. This combined with the energies of Jagathan's life force would release such a powerful surge of energy, it would destroy Jagathan, along with it opening a gate that would release Uriel Septim VII and Talon Warhaft from Mehrunes Dagon's prison, allowing Uriel Septim to return to ruling the Empire. But anyway, moving on. This being to around the year 405, as this is when an agent of the Blades would summon Mehrunes Dagon. Dagon would make a deal with the agent, offering the agent power in return for killing a Frost Daedra that Dagon felt needed to be punished. Now, once the agent had managed to kill the Frost Daedra, they would be given Mehrunes Razor. Now, moving on to the year 427 in the Third Era, as this is when the Naravarine would also encounter Mehrunes Dagon. This being when the Naravarine would visit Dagon's shrine just off the coast of Vardenfell. Mehrunes Dagon desired to test the worthiness of the Naravarine, so Dagon would send the Naravarine on a quest to recover Mehrunes Razor. Apparently, Mehrunes Razor had been previously stolen by an unworthy elf, eventually ending up in the Alas ancestral tomb. Now, there is a book claiming that the weapon at some point had been in the possession of Master Neloth. However, after offending some acrobats, it was stolen by the troop as an act of revenge. But anyway, the Naravarine would go on to find a rusty dagger in the ancestral tomb, bringing it back to Mehrunes Dagon, who would restore the blade to its former glory before gifting it to the Naravarine. But anyway, moving on. This being to the year 433 in the Third Era. Now, with the several decades passing since the Imperial Simulacrum, Mehrunes Dagon sought to be at the forefront of the takeover, desiring to actually invade Neon himself this time, which is where a chain of events would occur leading to a new era. This starting with the assassination of Uriel Septim VII. So Emperor Uriel initially escaped the attack, which began at the White Gold Tower. The Emperor and his guards, the Blades, would make their way down to the dungeons, down to a secret escape route. Here, the Emperor would pardon a fortunate prisoner for reasons only known to Uriel Septim himself. Although it would seem as if the Emperor would escape, the assassins would actually manage to pick off the guards and eventually kill Uriel Septim. Before he would pass, Emperor Uriel would give the Amulet of Kings to the fortunate prisoner, who would luckily manage to escape the assassins through the sewer system. It would eventually be revealed that these assassins were actually members of the Mythic Dawn. Now, with the death of the Emperor and any known family members who could have taken the throne, Tamriel was thrown into chaos. The prisoner would eventually head to Waynon Priory, with the Amulet of Kings in their possession. Here they would give the amulet to Joffrey, the Grandmaster of the Blades, who would send the prisoner on a mission to find the bastard of Uriel Septim, their seventh. This being a lowly priest over in Kvatch by the name of Martin. This being due to Martin supposedly being the only one who could use the Amulet of Kings to relight the dragon fires and save Tamriel from Mehrunes Dagon and the Mythic Dawn cult. The prisoner would eventually arrive at Kvatch, however, the city would be overrun by Daedra due to the Oblivion Gate that was opened there, thus beginning what was known as the Oblivion Crisis. The prisoner would manage to close the Oblivion Gate, and with the help of Martin and the surviving Kvatch guards, the Daedra would be fought off. The prisoner would be now known as a new name, the Hero of Kvatch. So the Hero of Kvatch would return to Waynon Priory, bringing Martin along. However, they did not find the Grandmaster of the Blades patiently waiting. Instead, he would be fighting off Mythic Dawn agents who had attacked the Priory. Thankfully, Martin, the Hero of Kvatch, and Joffrey would survive the attack, but the Amulet of Kings would be lost during the attack. The group would then head to the Cloud Ruler Temple to ensure Martin's safety as the only remaining heir to the throne. So the Hero of Kvatch would go looking for the amulet, believing it to be with the Mythic Dawn cultists. The Hero of Kvatch, with the help of Boris, a member of the Blades, would decipher where the Mythic Dawn cultists were hiding. This being through deciphering Mankar Cameron's commentaries on the Mysterium Zarsus. The Hero of Kvatch would manage to gain entry into the Mythic Dawn lair near Lake Arius, either through trickery or through force, depending on the story. This is where the Hero of Kvatch would discover that Mankar Cameron was behind the Mythic Dawn cult, and the cult worshipped Mehrunes Dagon. The Hero of Kvatch would manage to escape the lair with the Mysterium Zarsus. However, Mankar Cameron would flee to Oblivion with the Amulet of Kings. With the Mysterium Zarsus, the Hero of Kvatch would return to the Cloud Ruler Temple, presenting the book to Martin, who would translate the book with great difficulty, risking his own sanity. This was done in hopes of being able to use the book to create a portal to Mankar Cameron to retrieve the Amulet of Kings. But before the ritual could be performed, an Oblivion Gate would be opened just outside of Bruma. This would lead to the Hero of Kvatch travelling to Bruma and entering the Oblivion Gate to close it before a Daedric siege engine could destroy the city. This giving the Hero of Kvatch yet another nickname, this being the Saviour of Bruma. With Bruma and the Cloud Ruler Temple now being safe from the threat of Daedric invasion, Martin would open a portal to Mankar Cameron's paradise. The Hero of Kvatch would enter the portal and travel through the realm, eventually finding Mankar Cameron and killing him. After doing so, the Hero of Kvatch would manage to retrieve the Amulet of Kings. The Hero of Kvatch would return to the realm of the living, giving the Amulet of Kings to Martin, who would take the amulet to the Elder Council. This being with the hopes of crowning Martin Emperor and then relighting the dragon fires to prevent any more Daedra from entering the mortal plane. However, there would be no official coronation, this being due to an announcement that the Imperial City was under attack. Oblivion Gates had opened in the city, and Dagon was at the door. The group would rush out, attempting to protect the Emperor whilst fighting the Daedric invaders, leading to Emperor Martin making the decision to use the Amulet of Kings, shattering it and becoming the avatar of Akatosh. Akatosh's avatar would do battle with Mehrunes Dagon, eventually managing to send Dagon back to Oblivion. However, Martin too would be gone. All that would be left is a stone statue of Akatosh. But anyway, moving on. This being to the 4th era. This being with the last Dragonborn in the year 201 in the 4th era. So the last Dragonborn would hear about a museum over in Dawnstar. This museum being the Museum of the Mythic Dawn, which happened to be run by the descendant of one of the Mythic Dawn members, Silas Vesuvius. Curious, the last Dragonborn would head to Dawnstar to check out the museum. Here, they would observe Silas being confronted by a member of the public, who would tell Silas that the past is in the past. The museum should not open. The last Dragonborn would then meet with Silas and tour the museum, which is where Silas would give the last Dragonborn a quest. This quest being to recover the pieces of Mehrunes' razor, which had been broken by the militia known as Keepers of the Razor, which had been formed to hunt down and destroy any remnants of the Mythic Dawn cult. The broken pieces had been given to the highest ranking members of the inner circle of the group. These pieces would then be passed down through their families. This being until the year 201, where the last Dragonborn would manage to recover the pieces of Mehrunes' razor, then would return them to Silas. Silas would then request that the last Dragonborn meet him at Mehrunes Dagon's shrine in an attempt to get Mehrunes Dagon to put the dagger back together. After arriving at the shrine, Dagon would speak to the last Dragonborn, offering the last Dragonborn the dagger if the last Dragonborn killed Silas. It is unknown whether or not the last Dragonborn killed Silas or fled with Silas. So based on the history of Mehrunes Dagon, why would anyone choose to worship him? Well, if we look at the events of the Second Era, more specifically the events of the Longhouse dynasty, Mehrunes Dagon had made a deal with the first in the dynasty, Duakurak. This being that Dagon would provide his assistance with the Longhouse dynasty taking over the throne of Tamriel. This being in return for, of course, their help in merging Nian and the Deadlands through the creation and use of the Four Ambitions. Now, Dagon would provide Duakurak and his allies with assistance in the beginning to remove the former Emperor Atrebus, who was a warlord and considered a pretender to the imperial throne. Considering that Dagon is the Prince of Change, he would be happy to do so as long as the deal was fulfilled. So in this instance, Dagon offered great power to the members of the Longhouse dynasty. If we look at the continuation of their work through the Order of the Waking Flame after the Colovian Revolt, we see the beliefs of Sister Saldina, who was a high-ranking member of the Order of the Waking Flame cult. Now with Sister Saldina's long history with Dagonites, it has not always been positive, nor has she always been a follower of Dagon. No, her first encounter with them was during the 541 invasion of High Rock by the Reachmen, led by Duakurak. Saldina was 16 at the time, a sister at the Priory of the Golden Staff, which was a priory dedicated to Magnus. Now during this invasion, the Reachmen would kill Saldina's brothers and sisters at the Priory. Saldina, however, managed to survive, but she was taken as a slave by the Reachmen. However, they would eventually discard her. Now, Saldina, during her time at the Priory, had once been shown forbidden texts by a monk. These forbidden texts mentioned Magna Gi, looking for a special tool that could unmake the world. Because of this, she would seek out the Order of the Waking Flame. Saldina would join the cult. Learning about their teachings, she would believe in them, seeing that Dagon could remake the world in the way that some of the Magna Gi desired. This leading to her eventually having a child who would be known as the Fourth Ambition. After the child learned this, she lost her memory and became known as the Anchorite. Now with Saldina's story, her worship and working with Mehrunes Dagon comes from the trauma she experienced at the hands of other Dagonites, leading to her desiring vengeance and the destruction of a world so flawed that she could go through all of that. Saldina desired to take her power back, which led to her becoming one of Dagon's biggest supporters in the Order of the Waking Flame, viewing Dagon as a necessary evil. If we now look at Jagasan, he is likely the descendant of the House of Tharn, who were one of the most distinguished families of northern Nibelheim. Members of the House of Tharn were known as having positions of power serving the Empire. We also see their dedication with Regulus Tharn restoring the tradition of imperial battle mages. Now we know that Jagasan had served as the imperial battle mage to Uriel Septim VII. He would provide Septim with council and arcane support during the expansion of the Empire. However, through time and with Septim learning, he would eventually no longer rely so heavily on Tharn, thus giving Tharn the opportunity to overthrow him. But also, this would decrease Tharn's importance in the court, as his council was less influential and important as it had previously been. So, Jagasan, however, desired to be more than just a battle mage, desiring the power that came with being an emperor, along with desiring to remove all who could compete with him as an imperial battle mage. So Jagasan was provided this power by Mehrunes Dagon, and Dagon was given the battle spire in return. Now, if we look at Mankar Cameron and his reason for worshipping Mehrunes Dagon, well, not much is really known about his life prior to the founding of the Mythic Dawn cult. However, we do know that he was born during the final battle against Cameron the Usurper, also known as Haemon Cameron. Now, it is suggested that Mankar may actually be the son of Cameron the Usurper, this being due to his mother, Kalis, being the former mistress of Cameron the Usurper. Now, after Mankar's birth, his mother would take him and flee into the wilderness, which is why not so much is known about his upbringing. However, it is known that Mehrunes Dagon would specifically choose Mankar, giving him the Mysterium Zarsus and making Mankar his mortal champion. Mankar would read the Mysterium Zarsus, learning much from the book written by Mehrunes Dagon. Mankar would go to write his own book, this being commentaries on the Mysterium Zarsus. Mankar would also bind himself to the Mysterium Zarsus using unholy rituals, which would provide him with the power to create his own plane in Oblivion, this being Paradise or Gaia Alatar. So for Mankar Cameron, he viewed himself as a sort of herald or harbinger of a reborn mortal world, that he was given the power through his connection to Mehrunes Dagon to bring about the new world that he would be the leader of. So Mehrunes Dagon provided power to individuals through deals and bargains to assist in changing their situation, which is why these individuals decided to worship him. But this does not tell us why groups have been attracted to worshipping Dagon. For that, we should move on to discussing the worshippers. When it comes to the worship, or at least acknowledgement of Mehrunes Dagon, it can come from either a cult or cultural reasons, this even being present in the Daedra themselves. So for the worshippers, we should begin with the various cultures of Tamriel and their reasons behind either worshipping or at least acknowledging Dagon. With the cultures that worship Dagon, the first we should mention is actually the Dunmer. So the Dunmer history with Mehrunes Dagon begins before they were actually the Dunmer. This being before the Tribunal Temple became gods. So during the time of the Kaima, it is said that Mehrunes Dagon, along with the rest of the House of Troubles, were part of the ancestor spirits that came with Saint Veloth and the Kaima to the promised land of Morrowind. But with the rise of the Tribunal Temple, Mehrunes Dagon, Molag Bal, Malakath, and Shagarath would rebel against the Tribunal Temple. Now with this, they would become known as the House of Troubles, serving as a sort of testing role for the Dunmer. Each of these four represents one of the four corners of the House of Troubles, with Mehrunes Dagon being the god of destruction, being associated with natural disasters like fires, earthquakes, and floods. For some Dunmer, he represents the inhospitable land of Morrowind, testing the Dunmer's will to survive and persevere. Now, there have been interactions between the Tribunal Temple and Mehrunes Dagon over the years, leading to the establishment of some of their religious practices. One of these being seen with the Pilgrim's Path, specifically in the Puzzle Canal. So, in the Puzzle Canal, there is a place known as the Shrine of Courtesy. Now, this shrine comes from one interaction between Vivek and Mehrunes Dagon. So, Mehrunes Dagon and Vivek were fighting. However, Dagon was unarmed, and Vivek did not want to dishonor himself by fighting a disarmed foe. So, Vivek would give Dagon his own silver longsword. Now, this would impress the Dremora, these being the most chivalrous and honorable of Dagon's Daedric servants. This would lead to a bond of mutual respect and courtesy between the Dremora and the followers of the Tribunal. However, they would still be enemies. This would lead to this shrine being part of the Pilgrim's Path, which are the shrines of the 7 graces that a pilgrim must visit to become part of the Tribunal Temple. Now, the Shrine of Courtesy reenacts the old story, this being through a pilgrim gifting a silver longsword to a Dremora known as Krast, who is present at the shrine. But this is not the only evidence of Dagon being important in Dunmeri religion. We also see it with the pilgrimage to Mar Garn being an important part of the Tribunal Temple religion. Now, this stems from another interaction between Vivek and Mehrunes Dagon. So this comes from the story that Mehrunes Dagon had once threatened the Dunmer of Mar Garn. He did so with a large rock, threatening to throw it onto the town, but Vivek would stop this. Vivek would taunt Dagon, and this would instead make Dagon throw the rock at Vivek, protecting the town. This would lead to the rock becoming a shrine in Mar Garn, with a Dremora becoming bound to fulfill the role of Dagon, whilst pilgrims taunt the Dremora acting as Vivek. So, although Mehrunes Dagon does not feature as a main god that is worshipped in the Dunmeri Tribunal Temple, he is still rather important in their mythology. But there are also other races and cultures where Mehrunes Dagon is observed as part of their mythology and religion. An example of this being in the Khajiit, especially in their early religion. So for the Khajiit, in their origin story, Dagon, or Mehrunes as he is called, is described as a Jar Khajiit, or a kitten, because what is more destructive than a kitten? Dagon is also called a demon cat in other Khajiit descriptions. So in the pre-Redata beliefs of the Khajiit, Dagon, not long after he was born, would become destructive. This would lead to him getting exiled by Anur. Dagon would explore the Great Darkness, which is where he would be captured by the demon Molag, being tortured by Molag until the creation of the world. During the chaos, Dagon would be released by the wife of Molag. She would use the destructive nature of Mehrunes Dagon as a weapon against the Lattice. This is where he would become known as a kinslayer. These pre-Redata myths also claim that Molag, Mehrunes, and Merid Nunda teamed up to attack the Lattice together, but they were stopped by Azura, Bawethra, Mafala, and Noctra. Anyway, this is not the full extent of Dagon's present in Khajiit beliefs. There is evidence of Firecat or Mehrunes Dagon worship in Khajiit history. with one of these worshippers actually being Darloch Bray, who is also known as the Golden Beast of Anaquina, who was a Khajiit warlord who was active in the 5th century of the First Era. Despite being a Dagon worshipper, Darloch would attempt to preserve Khajiit history. However, during his time, there would be Dagon cultists who would burn down the Grand Archive of Corinth in the year 463 in the First Era. This would lead to Darloch placing records throughout smaller vaults to try and preserve history. Anyway, in the Second Era in the year 582, there would be a resurgence of Khajiit worshippers, these being the Claws of Dagon, who would take over the Dark Pool mines, which had been once dug by Darloch. Now the Claws of Dagon had taken the mine and were summoning Daedra and participating in rituals at all hours. This would be disturbing the locals in the area. So when it comes to Khajiit and their worship of Dagon, the majority of Khajiit do not worship him. However, he does play a part in their creation story. There are also small cults formed that do worship him. Now, there are also other races who do have some mention of Dagon in their religions in some very specific groups, rather than the entire race, or in the case of the Reachmen, specific individuals, like Dukorak. Dagon is believed to have a sort of duality, being both the Daedric Prince of Destruction, but also the Daedric Prince of Ambition. Now, considering the harsh nature of the Reach and the heavy focus on survival in the Reach culture, some Reachmen, through the ambition to survive, are pushed to worship who they view as the Lord of Ambition. This, of course, being Mehrunes Dagon. Now, if we instead look at the Argonians, there is only one known group of Dagon worshippers, this being the Sul-Zan tribe. So the Sul-Zan as a tribe focus more on the darker aspects of religion, one of these being, of course, worshipping Mehrunes Dagon, viewing others who do not follow their beliefs as weak. Part of their worshipping practices involves the use of sacrifices, these being both Argonians and outsiders. This being to bring about chaos and the spirit of destruction. The spirit of destruction being Mehrunes Dagon, but also apparently being part of the proposal process for Sul-Zan warlords, as their love interest is kidnapped and offered the decapitated heads of their neighbors. What happened to just asking with a ring? But anyway, the Sul-Zan tribe are very different when it comes to Argonian religious beliefs, being more violent and worshipping a Daedric prince along with Sithis rather than just the Hist. Now, those are the mortal cultures that have some form of an interaction, belief, or worship of the Daedric Prince Mehrunes Dagon. However, we also see there being at least one Dremora clan being worshippers and aligned with Mehrunes Dagon, this being the Crimson Oath. Now, the Crimson Oath are no friendly group of Daedra, who would through their preference be marauding or raiding their way through Tamriel, rather than labouring away under the orders of Mehrunes Dagon and his cults. The Crimson Oath claim to be the most loyal followers of Mehrunes Dagon, most trusted by him. However, not everyone shares that opinion of this group, with some in the Waking Flame insisting that the Crimson Oath are nothing more than brute killers. Now, speaking of cults, nothing brings together the races of Tamriel like a cult, and Mehrunes Dagon happens to have several. One of these being the Order of the Waking Flame. Now, when it comes to the Order of the Waking Flame, they do happen to have some rather interesting beliefs. The first of these being that Mehrunes Dagon was actually created by the Magna Gi, with Dagon being created as a weapon to unmake the world according to the plans of Magnus. This being done so Magnus could remake the world without flaws. Along with this, the Order of the Waking Flame also have their own stories about Mehrunes Dagon. This being the Epics of Mehrunes Dagon, which was written by the High Chronicler Valentin Leor of the Order of the Waking Flame. This being two stories of the successors of Dagon. The first of these stories discusses Dagon's devotion to deals and bargains, this being through the story of his deal with an enchanter known as Arabath. So for the deal, Arabath would gather the required materials, whilst Dagon was required to ensure that the wards would contain Dagon's might and oversee the formation of the magic. Arabath would, in the presenting of the bargain, tell Dagon that he was responsible for her safety. Arabath would then go on to draw her designs in the sand in front of the ocean, calling upon the power of the waves to bring back the dead and blighted trees. The water receded as Arabath drew more power from the ocean than she had previously expected. Arabath could only stand and stare at the mountainous wave that was speeding towards her, coming from the very depths of the ocean. Now, Dagon would remember his is part of the deal. He would quickly release his own spell. This spell would match the power of the ocean, with flames swelling up higher than the oncoming wave. This would transform the rushing water into steam. Arabath would find herself on the beach, unharmed in a patch of burned forest and steaming tide pools. A season later, the blighted trees would grow healthy branches and would prosper. Now, the second volume of the epics of Mehrunes Dagon focuses on Dagon's prowess in battle. So this story goes that deep in Cold Harbor, there were a group of Dagonites who labored under the watchful eye of Molag Bal's Daedric overseers. Their existence in Cold Harbor was filled with pain and suffering. However, they knew that Dagon was still with them. They drew strength from Mehrunes Dagon, and this would lead to them desiring to enact destructive change upon their captors. They did not expect to be able to leave Cold Harbor. However, they hoped to carry out incredible feats of sabotage and carnage. So they would wait, praying to Mehrunes Dagon, scheming whilst waiting for their time to strike. Now, during their time in Cold Harbor, some of the Dagonites would eventually lose faith, but others, the most righteous of the group, would remain devoted to Mehrunes Dagon. Because of their devotion and determination, they were gifted with an incredible explosion. This feat of magic would send spasms through the ground and would rattle the instruments of pain out of their captors' hands. The Dagon worshippers would leap forward as one, flames rising in the wake of their attack, and other prisoners seeing their success would join them in the attack. Now, above the heads of the mortals and the Daedra and the mountains of Cold Harbor, Mehrunes Dagon would appear. Molag Bal and Dagon would fight each other. During this fight, it would seem as though Molag Bal would win the battle, with Molag Bal even raising his goatee head to let out a furious bray. Then everything would fall silent. The battles on the ground would end with the enslaved lie amongst the Daedric overseers, all holding their hands over their bleeding ears, with some who were fighting closest to Molag Bal laying amongst the rubble, their bodies broken because of his braying. So not only does Molag Bal smell really bad, but he makes ear-bleedingly bad donkey noises. However, the true believers of Mehrunes Dagon were not amongst the fallen. No, they would instead open their eyes to the heat of the Deadlands. Dagon had freed them from the clutches of Molag Bal, doing so whilst fighting Molag Bal, using only a projection of himself. So for the Order of the Waking Flame, Mehrunes Dagon serves more than one purpose. He to some is viewed as a protector and savior of his true believers, which we see with the tales in the epic. To others, he is viewed as the tool necessary to remake the world, to create an unflawed world that would not be abandoned by the gods. But there are also other cults that exist, worshipping Mehrunes Dagon, with one of the most important being the Mythic Dawn. Now, the Mythic Dawn, who are led by Mankar Cameron, have different beliefs about Dagon and existence. They believe that the Aedra were not true gods. Instead, they were the betrayers of Lorkhan. These false gods were posing as divines. Mankar would argue that the real gods were actually the Daedra, also claiming that Lorkhan was actually a Daedric prince and Tamriel was really the Daedric realm of Lorkhan. The Oblivion Crisis was not an invasion, but a liberation. The liberation would usher in the new dawn of Tamriel. So based on the worshippers of Mehrunes Dagon, why would anyone choose to worship him? Well, if we firstly consider the Reachman's belief in what Dagon is, being not only the Daedric Prince of Destruction, but also the Daedric Prince of Ambition, then it is understandable how some of the more ambitious Reach folk, like for example Durkarak, would end up worshipping him, believing that Dagon could help them achieve their goals, especially those goals which may seem rather out of reach or far-fetched. We know that Durkarak was supported in his rise to power by Mehrunes Dagon, becoming the Emperor of Tamriel and the first of the Reachmen in the Longhouse dynasty. However, this is not the only reason why some may turn to worshipping Mehrunes Dagon. For those who are part of the Order of the Waking Flame, they view the world as deeply flawed, needing to be remade. They see Dagon as a tool to destroy the broken world and have it remade in the way that Magnus desired. For them, Mehrunes Dagon is an agent of change. But with the tales from the epics of Mehrunes Dagon, he is also portrayed as a Daedra that enjoys to make deals and bargains, these benefiting those who are careful about the deals they make, along with Dagon being strong and a talented fighter, protecting and saving those who are true believers and worshippers. For those who believe in the words of Mankar Cameron, Aneurin, being part of the mythic Dawn cult. Dagon is not invading Tamriel. Instead, he is liberating the occupied lands. He is rescuing them from the false gods. By liberating and cleansing Tamriel, he is bringing a true god to the lands. So Mehrunes Dagon, as a Daedric prince, to many of his worshippers is bringing about a new order, a new world without pain, weakness and flaws that the current Mundus has. But this does not tell us about how his creations have played a part in inspiring worship. For that, we should move on to discuss the various realms, beings, and even artifacts that Mehrunes Dagon has created. So when it comes to the creations of Mehrunes Dagon, there are 3 different types to discuss. These being his realms in Oblivion, his creatures, and of course, his Daedric artifacts. To begin, we should start with his realms in Oblivion. Now, Dagon actually has more than one realm in Oblivion attributed to him. However, the realm that Dagon specifically created and rules over is the Deadlands. Now, the realm is very much an embodiment of Dagon. As with Mehrunes Dagon being the Prince of Chaos, Destruction, and Change, this realm is filled with natural disasters and destructive change. Because of this, the realm is filled with many vastly different regions. One of these being the Sever, which appears as a region filled with jagged rocks and sulfur pools throughout. But it is also a region that is filled with fierce winds, constant lightning storms, tornadoes, and extreme temperatures, making the region a rather unstable home for the creatures that inhabit it. There is also the Burn, which is an area that is covered by an ocean of lava. This region contains what is known as the Brand Fire Reformatory, this place being used to train and indoctrinate new recruits along with torturing souls. There is also more to the Deadlands than its dangerous regions. There is the various Daedric buildings that can also be found there. The Deadlands are filled with monoliths, war gates, bridges, and towers. The towers of the Deadlands feature Daedric-style architecture, being decorated with ornamental spikes, dim lighting, and rotting corpses, along with prisoners who will become future corpses. Some buildings feature corpse mashers, which will mash and mangle prisoners and their corpses. Now, if this does not sound like your personal Daedric holiday destination, Dagon does have other realms associated with him, including the cozy little realm known as the Chimera of Desolation. Now, the lovely little realm in Oblivion was once an island off the coast of Tamriel, this being Cecily Island, now home to 2 ghost towns, with only one living resident existing on the island. This resident being Chimera Gragan, who also happens to be why there is a Tamrielic island in the middle of a Daedric realm, with Gragan cheating Dagon in a deal leading to Cecily Island being thrown into the void. The island has become important for several reasons, being known to host the ritual of the Innocent Quarry, also known as the Great Hunt. There is also another plane in Oblivion that is associated with Mehrunes Dagon, this being Havoc Wellhead. This plane functioned as one of the provincial government centres for Dagon, being used as an important location for coordinating the attack on the Battle Spire. This being before Dagon lost access after the Battle Spire was destroyed. Havoc Wellhead was once controlled by several Daedric clans associated with Mehrunes Dagon, with it even housing the castle of Imago Storm, who was an important member of the invasion of the Battle Spire. Now, along with the realms of Oblivion, there are also the creatures that Dagon has created. In this section, there does deserve to be a special mention of Mehrunes Dagon's adopted children, as although he did not cause them to be born, he greatly shaped them. So the first of Mehrunes Dagon's children is Zivalai Moath. Zivalai is a Daedric lord, who was the leader of Zivalai's clan. Zivalai was one of the leaders of the Daedric invasion of the Battle Spire and Shade Perilous. He was actually who managed to create a deal with Jagathan that would make the invasion of Battle Spire successful, where it had previously been unsuccessful every other time Mehrunes Dagon attempted to invade. Now we also have Phaedra Shaddai, who is the other adopted child of Mehrunes Dagon. She is the leader of the Shaddai clan and was also important in the invasion of the Battle Spire and Shade Perilous, doing so with her brother's clan as well as her clan. However, these clans, having opposing elemental Daedra, did not like each other. In fact, they were enemies, leading to a pact to be formed to prevent infighting. However, as the invasion went on, the relationship did not last. This being due to ongoing sibling rivalry and the meddling of the apprentice. Now, when it comes to the Daedra that Mehrunes Dagon is associated with, we also see what are known as Scorians in the Deadlands. So these Scorians are a spider-like Daedra. They have previously been described as Deadland-touched arachnoids. Scorians have 6 legs, which are used for walking and climbing. Along with this, they have several small fang-like appendages at the front, having a hollow abdomen along with a thorax. These Daedra are used for collecting and transferring magical energy, glowing orange or red when energy is collected, depending on the type of energy collected, which they were used by the Order of the Waking Flame to do. However, outside of this, these creatures are rarely seen. Now, there are also other Daedric creatures that are associated with Mehrunes Dagon, an example of these being the Infernium. Well, that being its mortal name. Its real name being completely unpronounceable to those who are not of Daedric origin. These Daedra are a rather large and hideous being much larger and much uglier than other Daedra. The Infernium have been described as having a similar appearance to a huge fanged leech, or even a monstrous caterpillar. Now, what is interesting about these Daedra is their obsession with upheaval and revolution, being much more keenly aware of where political and cultural power rests. With this, high-ranking Daedra more often fall prey to the attacks of Infernium than lower-ranking Daedra. The Infernium also have a habit of consuming powerful items, like Grand Soul Gems. Infernium can sometimes be found with Havrokrel. In some cases, they are said to be the keepers of Infernium. Infernium are primarily found in the Deadlands, but they can also be found in Deadlight and occasionally Cold Harbor. Now, perhaps the most interesting Daedra associated with Dagon are the Ruinarchs. What makes them interesting is the claim of where they originate, this going all the way back to the First Era in the year 2920. This story beginning with a member of the Skeffington Coven, Turala, desiring revenge on the Duke of Mournhold, who was her former lover, and the father of her child. So Turala would summon Mehrunes Dagon to slay the Duke, and Dagon happily obliged. During the destruction of Mournhold, Amalexia and Sotha Sil would arrive. The duo would fight Mehrunes Dagon. During this battle, some of Dagon's flesh would fall off. With every chunk that fell off, Samis on Naum's ghoul things would emerge. Now, some believe that these creatures were the Ruinarchs. The Ruinarchs believe this to be their origin story. They claim direct Dagonic ancestry. However, most other Daedra do not believe in this. Either way, the Ruinarchs are Mehrunes Dagon's fanatics, sometimes referring to themselves as the Fifth Hand, believing that they are a direct manifestation of Dagon's will. Considering some of their similar behavior, like their proneness to destructive tantrums, this being similar to Dagon himself. The Ruinarchs are also not known to be particularly intelligent. However, they do happen to have incredible strengths. Now, we should also include another special mention here when it comes to the creations of Dagon, this being the 4 ambitions, as they were technically a creation that Dagon and his followers made, these being not Daedric creatures, but also not artifacts. So the 4 ambitions are 4 powerful beings that have been associated with Mehrunes Dagon. These beings are often represented by a boar, a fox, and a pair of rams. Now, the 4 ambitions were supposed to be created by the emperors of the Longhouse dynasty in return for Dagon's assistance in bringing them to power, with the Order of the Waking Flame assisting in the rituals to create these 4 ambitions. Now, these were no simple rituals, with the final ritual requiring a human sacrifice to imbue the ambitions with power from Mehrunes Dagon. Considering this, the 4 ambitions, once allowed out into the world, would pose great risks to those surrounding them and even themselves. This being due to the instability that the great power imbued in them caused. Now, the first 3 of the ambitions all had the same ritual. However, the last of the ambitions, the ritual to create Maraid, would be different. This being due to Emperor Morikar not trusting Mehrunes Dagon. Maraid would be created as a weapon that could banish Dagon, if Dagon did not fulfill his part of the bargain. Now, the last group of creations we should discuss are the artifacts associated with Mehrunes Dagon. The first of the artifacts that should be discussed is no weapon, but it is still a tool of great destruction, this being the book known as the Mysterium Zarses. The Mysterium Zarses was said to be written by Mehrunes Dagon. It is considered to be an artifact of great and evil power. Now, when it comes to those who are reading or even just handling the book, magical protection is required, this being due to its vile and corrupting influences. which is why it is considered tracked perilous. This meaning that the book is a great danger, not because what the person who possesses it may do, but what the book may do to those who possess it. We see the book's corrupting power with one of the ambitions, this being Sombren, who after reading the Mysterium Zarsis was corrupted. He attempted to deliver the remaining 4 ambitions to Dagon because of how the book affected Sombren. Now we also see the influence of the Mysterium Zarsis elsewhere, this being in the hands of Mankar Cameron, who would be inspired by the promises and prophecies written within the Mysterium Zarsis, leading to him creating a cult, this being the Mythic Dawn. The Mythic Dawn would worship Dagon and the Mysterium Zarsis would serve as their holy book. Now the Mysterium Zarsis was said to have been mostly destroyed during the Oblivion Crisis. However, there was one damaged page to survive the destruction. But this is not the only artifact of importance when it comes to Mehrunes Dagon. No, another artifact we should mention is Mehrunes Razor. Mehrunes Razor was said to have been formed through the binding of Lesser Daedra to Mehrunes Dagon. Now when it comes to the dagger, it is claimed that it has the ability to kill those it strikes instantly. With those killed by the blade, Mehrunes Dagon is able to claim their souls, making it a rather powerful weapon. Now the dagger had once been locked behind a test, this being through a construct that Dagon had created to test the worth of challengers. This construct being the Nefari Vigum, which had attracted many challengers. However, the aliens did not want Mehrunes' dagger in the world, so they would attempt to lock it away in the 1st century in the city of Vasa Balim. The city, however, would not stand the test of time, with a vampire managing to enter the city and begin turning the citizens. This would lead to the city eventually being hidden below the mountains in the eastern Nibonate Basin. Now the Razor has shown up throughout history in various locations. However, during the Oblivion Crisis, the hero of Kvatch would find the Nefari Vigum in the Vasa Balim, and would defeat the champion, thus retrieving Mehrunes' Razor, giving them great power. Now there are other artifacts associated with Mehrunes Dagon that also provide great power, one of these being the Sword of the Moon Reaver. The reason why this artifact is important is that the weapon was forged from Dagon's own substance, which is why this is the only weapon that could supposedly harm him. This would become important in the events of the invasion of the Battle Spire during the Imperial Simulacrum, allowing the apprentice to banish Dagon, however destroying the Battle Spire in the process. So based on the creations of Mehrunes Dagon, why would anyone choose to worship him? Well, in the case of the creations, there are artifacts like the Sword of the Moon Reaver and Mehrunes Razor that would provide the person wielding them with great power, with the Sword of the Moon Reaver being the only weapon supposedly able to harm Dagon. But Mehrunes Razor is powerful for another reason. This dagger supposedly kills its victim with one hit, making those who use it incredibly powerful in battle. Now there is also the interesting artifact, this being the Mysterium Zarsis. The Mysterium Zarsis is a rather dangerous artifact, as this artifact being an unsuspecting danger as it has the ability to convert someone into a follower, as we see with Sombren, having the power to mess with someone's mind with continued interactions, like the Ring of Power in The Lord of the Rings, which also corrupts those who interact with the ring. However, instead of reading it, it is wearing the ring causing the corruption. So in some cases, Mehrunes Dagon manages to gain worshippers through corrupting interactions with his own artifacts. Along with this, we can also see a reason for the Daedra, more specifically the Ruinarchs, worshipping Dagon. This being due to their beliefs that they are literally the spawn of Dagon, coming from Dagon's fallen flesh during a battle in the First Era between the Tribunal and Mehrunes Dagon. The Ruinarchs call themselves the Fifth Hand of Mehrunes Dagon, believing that they are a direct manifestation of Mehrunes Dagon's will, which has led them as a Daedric species to being blindly loyal to Dagon. So based on who Mehrunes Dagon is, his history, who worships him, along with the various creations of Mehrunes Dagon, we can finally answer the question: why would anyone choose to worship him? If we look at the various descriptions of Mehrunes Dagon, there are claims that the Dagonites as a group are people who like to set fires to things, buildings, animals, and even people, which also inspires their recruitment, with Dagonites targeting the outcasts of towns like criminals, rebellious teenagers, and generally people that are not welcome there. People who otherwise would be considered problematic, like the behavior of the Dagonites, and who may also have destructive impulses. The recruitment occurring throughout Tamriel. So for the Reach folk, Mehrunes Dagon is known as more than just a Daedric Prince of Destruction, but also the Daedric Prince of Ambition. With the Reach lifestyle being heavily about perseverance and survival, this would lead to many members of the Reach being more ambitious and potentially even turning to Dagon to achieve their goals. We see this with Dur-Karak, the first of the Longhouse dynasty. He would make deals with Mehrunes Dagon and the Tag Droylok Coven to ensure that Dur-Karak would end up on the Ruby Throne. Now we also see with others that have worshipped Mehrunes Dagon their reasons for worshipping, this being people like Sister Saldina, who was not always a worshipper of Mehrunes Dagon. Instead, she was once a member of a priory worshipping Magnus. This priory would be invaded by the Order of the Waking Flame, with the vast majority of its members being killed. Sister Saldina, however, would manage to survive, being kidnapped by Dagonites, however eventually being released. This is what led her on her own path to Dagon worship, viewing the world as incredibly flawed, as something that needed to be remade, seeing Dagon as a tool for this after joining the Waking Flame. Saldina would merge her own views on Magnus and Mehrunes Dagon to create reasons behind why the Dagonites were right to wish for the destruction of the world and attempt to bring about it. Considering the torture that Saldina went through, she wished for the world to be remade so no one else would have to suffer the way she had. Now with Mankar Cameron, he also wished for Dagon to take over Nian, but not to prevent suffering. Mankar believed that Nian was really just another plane of oblivion, and that Dagon needed to remove the weak so Mankar and the other strong people could rightfully rule. This merging with the beliefs of the Mythic Dawn cult, that it was not an invasion but a liberation from the false gods. Those who were true believers would be rewarded greatly once the invasion was successful, thus attracting downtrodden people wanting the tables to turn. With the Mythic Dawn using the Mysterium Zarsus as their holy book, we do see the importance that the artifacts of Mehrunes Dagon hold, with this artifact being able to transform those who oppose Dagon into worshippers without the correct protection. We see this prior to the existence of Mankar Cameron's cult with Sombren, one of the four ambitions, who would initially be against Mehrunes Dagon. However, after reading the Mysterium Zarsus, he would attempt to sacrifice the other ambitions to Dagon. So like with the Ring of Power in the Lord of the Rings, the Mysterium Zarsus is an incredibly corrupting artifact, swaying those who carry it to fulfill the goals, the wants, and the desires of the creator. Now there is also Mehrunes Razor, which provides the user with unbelievable power, causing death to those it is used against with just one hit, making it a powerful and destructive weapon. So Mehrunes Dagon is worshipped for numerous reasons. For some like Mankar Cameron and Sister Saldina, they believed that the world needed to change drastically and Dagon was the only thing able to do so. For others like Dur-Karak, Dagon, being the Daedric Prince of Ambition, allowed them to achieve their goals. Some, like those who searched for Mehrunes Razor, pursued Dagon for the immense power he could grant. So you yourself may choose to worship Mehrunes Dagon if you find yourself as an outcast, desiring destruction or destructive change, feeling a need for revenge against those who ostracized you or harmed you. Or you may also be a highly ambitious person, desiring to achieve something that may feel just out of reach. Or you could be someone who desires power and the ability to easily take down your foes. So let me know in the comments if you would worship Mehrunes Dagon. A special thank you to all of our Lore Archaeologist supporters. You guys help keep this channel running. And thank you to anyone who is joining our memberships. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, you should check out this one. It is about Vaermina and why anyone would choose to worship her.